Welcome everyone to the webinar on mercury fluorescent lighting. I think we're gonna give a couple more minutes for people to join. It's not the hour yet. Thank you for joining. Yeah, I think let's get it started. Thank you everyone. Welcome to this webinar on mercury fluorescent lighting. Thank you for joining us today to discuss a recent report released by the Clean Lighting Coalition in partnership with the Mercury Policy Project and Responsible Purchasing Network. I wanted to give you a quick background on the Clean Lighting Coalition first before we get started. We are a global campaign working to transition global markets to mercury-free, cost-effective and energy-saving LED lighting through the Minamata Convention of Mercury. Our coalition has members from public health authorities, mercury experts, NGOs, and industry partners, all working together for a global phase out of mercury lighting through the convention. And it is in that context that we approached earlier this year, Michael Bender, Alicia Culver, and Peter Maxson, with some questions about the health risks of mercury fluorescent lamps. And in particular, we wanted to know what are the risks of exposure from mercury in lamps, who is most at risk and under what circumstances. We also wanted to understand the risk not only when lamps are used, but also over the lifetime, especially because there are workers that can be exposed to mercury in lamps, for instance, in manufacturer facilities, in recycling facilities and landfills. And we also wanted to understand other environmental impacts related to the use of mercury in lamps. We use lighting everywhere in our homes, offices, schools, hospitals. And in this process, we talk a lot about the need to continue tolerating the risks associated to mercury in lighting when we have an alternative that is mercury-free, that offers other benefits, especially an alternative that is now widely available and that is much more efficient, which is LEDs. So we thought having a conversation about the benefits and including that in the report was also important. Today, Michael, Peter, and Alicia are going to walk us over some of the findings of the report, are going to give us answers to those questions as well. And they will be telling us specific recommendations and actions that different stakeholders across various sectors can take to accelerate the transition to mercury-free lighting. I also wanted to thank a group of organizations that participated as peer reviewers in this process that are joining us today as co-releasers of the report. These organizations are the Children's Environmental Health Network, Clean Water Action California, Healthy Babies, Bright Futures, Ecology Center, and the Vermont Public Interest Research Group. And we actually have some of those organizations joining us today in a panel. We will be talking about the report and talking about actions needed to protect public health and the environment from mercury in fluorescent lamps. So let me introduce you to the authors of the report first. I'm gonna start with Michael. Michael Bender is the director of the Mercury Policy Project. He has worked for over 25 years on waste management and mercury issues. He started in 1992, where he co-founded and directed the North American Hazardous Materials Management Association for several years. He founded the Mercury Policy Project in 1998, which promote policies to virtually eliminate mercury uses and releases, reduce exposures, and eliminate trade and primary mercury mining. He also co-founded and coordinates the Zero Mercury Working Group, which is an international NGO coalition with more than 110 groups from over 55 countries, with the goal of reducing mercury in the global environment to a minimum through supporting the implementation of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to introduce now Peter Maxson. Peter is the director of the Brussels-based consultancy, Concord East West SRL. He has focused most of his efforts on mercury-related issues over the last 20 years. During this period, Peter has worked for the US EPA, the European Commission, UNEP, and other UN agencies, NGOs, such as the Zero Mercury Working Group, and others to better understand and manage mercury sources, mercury use in products and processes, global mercury trade, including life cycle mercury releases and exposures. And Peter contributed significantly to the development of the Minamata Convention on Mercury and continues to support a range of efforts to improve its implementation and extend its scope. Thank you for joining us, Peter, today. And finally, Alicia. Alicia is the executive director of the Responsible Purchasing Network. She is a national expert on sustainable procurement with more than 25 years of hands-on experience on this field. She also has deep knowledge of the environmental and technical attributes of lighting equipment, which she has used to create policies, specifications, and contracts promoting high-performance LED lamps and luminaires for several states and local governments. Outside the US, Alicia has helped the European Environmental Bureau draft technical comments and successfully advocate for a phase out of fluorescent lamps under the European Union's Restriction of Hazardous Substances Directive, the ROS Directive. Welcome, Alicia. Thank you for joining us. We're very excited to have you to talk about the report. I'll hand it over now to you, Michael, Peter, and Alicia. And Hannah, if we can put the slides up, that would be great.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Before getting started, I'd like to just give a brief shout out to express my appreciation to the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association. We have a representative from there today on our panel, and also IMERC members for the leading role they have played in support of phasing out mercury added products, not only in the United States, but indirectly globally. As an associate member of IMERC now, I've appreciated the opportunity over the years to work with IMERC members on phase out legislation and look forward to new opportunities to completely phase out mercury in all products. So the focus of today's webinar is on a report on mercury and fluorescent lighting, unnecessary health risk and actionable solutions. Our report outlines the health risk, environmental impacts of fluorescent lighting, details the many compelling advantages of transitioning to mercury-free alternatives, and gives actionable solutions to phase out mercury-added lamps in the United States, including several important recommendations. In particular, the report highlights the challenges of protecting the most vulnerable populations from mercury exposure risks from lamp breakage. For example, when a fluorescent lamp breaks, the cleanup recommendations detailed by the US EPA are above and beyond what most people are aware of and prepared to do. This includes immediate evacuation, ventilating the room for several hours, shutting off heating and cooling to avoid mercury dispersion, collecting all contaminated materials such as clothing, protective gloves, and rugs, and also placing them in a sealed plastic container and following their local government's disposal recommendations. These and other related issues will be discussed in more detail throughout our presentation. Next slide, please. This slide presents the typical mercury content of fluorescent lights. As you can see, most general use fluorescent lamps today contain between 5 and 10 milligrams, but the total amount adds up quickly with the sheer number in circulation. For example, in 2018, these lamps contained 1.8 metric tons of mercury, which was about 17% of the total mercury in products sold in the US that year, according to data reported to the US EPA. In 2020, there were more than 2.7 billion CFLs in linear fluorescent lights containing an estimated 12 to 15 metric tons of mercury. Next slide, please. During the entire life cycle of a fluorescent lamp, from primary mining to manufacturing to transportation, use, and final disposal, there are multiple pathways in which mercury is haphazardly released. After manufacturing, mercury releases occur whenever and wherever lamps break, including when discarded in trash bins, dumpsters, roll-offs, waste and recycling vehicles, transfer stations, during change-out and recycling operations, construction and demolition dumps, and especially from the working face of a landfill, and also prior to and during waste incineration and other waste disposal practices. Due to the low recycling rates in the United States today of less than 30% of business lamps and far less for households, most mercury from lamps is released to the environment during discard and disposal activities. Next slide, please. Based on the latest scientific research, our study identified those subpopulations of most concern from exposure to mercury. At the top of the list are sensitive populations, including the developing fetus, infants, children, and pregnant and breastfeeding women. People with underlying health conditions or those who are chronically exposed to a range of pollutants are also at greater risk. In addition to exposure during the manufacturing process, municipal waste and recycling workers are also at higher risk due to their close proximity to lamp breakage. Next slide, please. A state of Maine Department of Environmental Protection report found that a lamp broken indoors can result in mercury vapor levels far in exceedance of state guidelines. Most at risk are infants and the developing fetus, who are more susceptible to developmental disabilities. After breakage, the Maine study confirmed that mercury releases are elevated for at least 10 minutes, and toddlers are likely to experience the highest exposures. The Maine study also showed the potential elevated levels of mercury exposure when infants crawl over and agitate carpeting contaminated with mercury. And under certain circumstances, the Department of Environmental Protection recommended the contaminated carpeting to be removed. More information on cleanup procedures will be presented shortly by my colleague, Peter Maxson. Next slide, please. According to the latest research, when an individual is exposed to a mixture of toxic substances, the health effects of any or all of them can be magnified in unpredictable ways. Even if the exposure to a toxic substance is well below the standard, mixed exposures of toxic substances have been demonstrated to induce health effects that any of the individual substances would not induce at such a low dose. Moreover, such effects are magnified in vulnerable groups. As can be seen in the diagram, every time one vulnerability or exposure overlaps with another, the health risk is magnified. Next slide, please. Workers can be also exposed to mercury in a variety of situations when lamps are broken. The organs most affected by the inhalation of elemental mercury vapors are the brain and the kidneys. Various studies have observed impaired neurobehavioral functions associated with long-term occupational exposure to mercury vapors at relatively low levels. Weakened memory, insomnia, dizziness, and tremors, among other symptoms, have been observed in workers at higher exposures. For example, in 2017, an investigation at a lamp recycling facility in Wisconsin found elevated mercury levels in all 5 workers who were tested and clinical signs of mercury toxicity, including tremors, in 2 of those 5 workers. Use of personal protective equipment was inadequate, and mercury levels in indoor air far exceeded recommended safety thresholds. To get more into detail of the mercury exposure risks, I'm going to now turn the floor over to the report co-author, Peter Maxson, who will continue the presentation from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Can you hear me okay, Anna? Yeah. In the following slides, I will elaborate a bit on mercury exposures and limits. I'll touch on how to deal with broken fluorescent lamps and other small mercury spills, and I'll end with a few recommendations. In this slide, we point out that mercury exists in 3 forms: elemental, inorganic, and organic. Each form of mercury is toxic in its own way, and each with preferred exposure pathways, and each targeting particular parts of the body. Elemental or liquid mercury is the form of mercury commonly used in fluorescent lamps. Even in liquid form and at room temperature, it vaporizes readily, and even more rapidly as the temperature rises. The lungs take in mercury vapor and pass most of it to the bloodstream, where it then easily crosses the blood-brain barrier and can damage the central nervous system. Damage to the central nervous system may manifest itself as physical tremors, emotional effects, insomnia, neuromuscular changes, headaches, poor performance on tests of mental acuity, and such things. Other toxic effects have been observed most often in the immune system, the kidneys, and the lungs, and it became clear many years ago that exposure limits were needed. Next slide, please. For many years, government agencies and others have attempted to identify no observed adverse effect levels, better known as NOAELs, for mercury exposure. In other words, levels of exposure at which no negative health effects are observed for different subjects, adults, children, early life, for long versus short-term exposures, for workers and the general public. In the late 1990s, exposure limits were proposed for mercury levels in urine, blood, and hair. But then it was observed that mercury concentrations in urine, blood, and hair don't necessarily reflect the mercury accumulations in body tissues, especially the brain and kidneys. And the developing fetus was found to be most vulnerable, with rapidly developing organs and a limited ability, if any at all, to eliminate mercury from the body. All of this clearly complicates the setting of exposure limits. Next slide, please. This slide shows a selection of some of the recommended exposure limits for mercury vapor in air in nanograms per cubic meter, some of them developed many years ago. From the top, we show the typical concentration of mercury in ambient air. Next, we see the long-term exposure limit developed by California, then the limit developed by the ATSDR, specifically to ensure that children are protected, followed by the short-term exposure limit developed by California, and finally the ACGIH limit for occupational exposure. It's interesting to note the 1,000-fold difference between the long-term exposure limit developed by California and the ACGIH limit for basically long-term occupational exposure, which can be explained only by the fact that different criteria and safety margins were used in the setting of these limits. We perhaps shouldn't be surprised that mercury exposure limits that were once considered safe, even 10 years ago, are now seen by many researchers as not providing adequate protection from harm, especially for vulnerable individuals and populations. The next slide, please. Returning now to risks related to broken fluorescent lamps, the state of Maine, as Michael mentioned, published a research report in 2008 that examined mercury releases from broken lamps. Among other findings, it reported that following the breakage of a single CFL, the mercury concentration in the study room air often exceeded the Maine ambient air guideline of 300 nanograms per cubic meter, with short episodes above 25,000 nanograms per cubic meter, and in some cases, even above 50,000. In most cases, a short period of ventilation was sufficient to significantly reduce the concentration of mercury in the air. However, depending on the circumstances, for example, as simple as foot traffic on a contaminated carpet, the mercury air concentration sometimes rebounded, especially if the room was no longer ventilated. Which leads us to the question of what to do or not to do when a lamp breaks. Next slide, please. Let's start with what not to do. Vacuuming. Vacuuming up a broken CFL not only contaminates the vacuum cleaner, but also heats and raises the air mercury concentration, and even more in an unventilated space. Flushing the mercury down a drain. Mercury is 13 times heavier than water and tends to accumulate in plumbing systems. It has often been found in old high school and university laboratory piping systems when the piping is replaced. Likewise, one shouldn't put it into a washing machine. Since mercury is not destroyed by cleaning products and processes, it can easily contaminate a washing machine or other clothing it touches. On the other hand, knowing what one should do to deal with a mercury spill is even more challenging. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Hannah. Thank you. Based on recommendations from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, the ATSDR, and the US EPA, these are the short instructions. Well, sorry, back one slide, please, Hannah. Can we back up one slide? Thanks. These are the short instructions for cleaning up a small mercury spill, which may be found at the end of our report. The main steps include removing people and pets from the room, isolating the spill, ventilating the area, gathering a number of useful cleanup items such as Ziploc bags, rubber gloves, an eyedropper, duct tape, a flashlight, putting on waterproof gloves, carefully gathering any visible mercury beads, and then trying to collect less visible mercury, for which sulfur powder is especially useful if you have it on hand. Removing and discarding in a plastic bag or left outside any contaminated carpet, removing mercury from shoes and clothing, or placing them outside to evaporate in the sunlight, properly disposing of cleaning materials, and finally determining whether further action may be needed. The concerns raised in all of these slides lead us to the logical conclusion that when there's a safer alternative, and especially when that alternative is cost effective, the product with hazardous substances should no longer be used, which invites a number of recommendations. Next slide, please. Many websites and other platforms that currently promote fluorescent lamps as the energy effective solution, which is no longer accurate, can be updated in favor of LED lighting. Our organizations and others can inform the US State Department that we support the African region's proposed amendment to the UN's Minamata Convention on Mercury to phase out fluorescent lamps. This would apply to all 135 countries that have so far ratified the convention. States and local governments can adopt and/or enforce their current mercury reduction policies. Schools, childcare and healthcare facilities, public housing facilities, etc., can all make a priority of replacing their fluorescent lamps. Next slide, please. And finally, lighting manufacturers and distributors can be encouraged to stop promoting and selling fluorescents and to get behind legislation to phase out fluorescent lights. Utilities can advocate for federal, state, and local policies that contribute to the phase out of fluorescent lamps. And environmental groups can work together and do the same in the United States and globally. Our report co-author Alicia Culver, Executive Director of the Responsible Purchasing Network, will continue the presentation from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael and Peter. Great introduction. And I'm going to talk about LEDs and why they're ready. And as I've thought about these, there hasn't been one thing that has changed about LEDs now being available. But for many years, we have tolerated compact fluorescents and linear fluorescents on the basis that they were more energy efficient. But over time, as LEDs have improved and have come down in price, there's been a subtle but consistent shift to the point that fluorescent lighting no longer needs to be tolerated. So next slide, please. In general, there's now a consensus that the availability, price, and performance of LED lighting equipment has improved to the point where it's now considered the most cost-effective and reliable lighting option in the US marketplace and elsewhere as well. And you can see this information in many of the manufacturers' own websites as they're promoting LED products. And at the same time, while fluorescents are starting to be eliminated from the market and kind of dying on their on the vine on their own, we really think it's important to accelerate the transition to LEDs because of all of their environmental and health benefits. Next slide. So I just wanted to highlight some of the benefits of LEDs compared to fluorescents. If you look at a lot of the websites, they focus on LEDs compared to incandescent light bulbs. But our report gives kind of a new perspective where we compared LEDs specifically to compact fluorescent lamps and even linear fluorescent lamps. So LEDs are always mercury free. There are no LEDs that contain any mercury. And we just heard about the hazards of those. When we look at overall life cycle environmental impacts, LEDs are the clear winner. So from water pollution and energy efficiency and overall material usage in all the categories, LEDs are better. Obviously, energy efficiency is the most important element of a light bulb, often for many people, and they are clearly more energy efficient across the board. And they last longer, so they don't have to be manufactured as often. They don't have to be purchased as often. They don't have to be disposed of as often. Consequently, with all these benefits of energy efficiency and longer life, they often will save the user money. So that includes individual consumers that often are buying things like alternatives to incandescent light bulbs, so CFLs. If they replace them with LEDs, those can be cost effective. And even replacing linear tubes can pay for themselves relatively quickly, usually within a year. It's also important to point out that LEDs compared to fluorescents have much better performance. Fluorescents have never been very popular. They have poor quality. Sometimes, especially the earlier ones, they took a little time to come on. The magnetic, like T12 ones, will sometimes flickered, sometimes hummed, especially if they were working on magnetic ballasts. And LEDs have improved the light quality. You can often see better with the LEDs compared to fluorescents, and they're more often dimmable than what fluorescents were. So there are just many performance benefits for the user as well. Next slide. We look at LEDs and we can clearly say that they're safer than fluorescent lamps. We had a lot of conversations about, are they 100% completely safe? So we don't say that they're 100% safe. We say that they're safer than fluorescents for many, many reasons. Again, they have no mercury. And while it's true that they may contain small amounts of toxic materials, unlike fluorescents, they don't pose a direct danger to the users. So for example, if an LED breaks, the toxic materials will not vaporize into the air and expose people to them. Often any toxics are embedded in the electronics. LEDs are less prone to breakage because their casings are often made of plastic instead of glass. And when you're purchasing LED lamps, it's important to look for those that are called RoHS compliant. So that's the European Union's restriction of hazardous substances directive. And many of the lamps, even sold in the United States, will have a label saying that they're RoHS compliant. And this means that they're free of lead, cadmium, and hexavalent chromium, as well as toxic flame retardants. It's important to note that Energy Star requires any certified LEDs to be RoHS compliant. So that's a way to get the safest products out there. Next slide. LEDs are revolutionizing the lighting market. We just put this quote in from US Department of Energy, again, emphasizing that they've surpassed or matched all the conventional lighting technologies in terms of energy efficiency, lifetime, versatility, color quality, and that they're expected to continue to improve over time, decreasing in price, improving in quality, improving in energy efficiency. So they really are available today and expected to improve in the future. Next slide. I want to just go into a couple of specifics that are from the report. LEDs are more energy efficient than fluorescents. So what you can see is if you compare the compact fluorescent versus the LEDs, they are significantly more, LEDs are significantly more energy efficient than compact fluorescents. And the Energy Star program recognized this. And when they increased the minimum efficiency under the Energy Star program, today, almost no compact fluorescent lamps are considered are included and certified under the Energy Star program anymore. You might still see some lamps in the market labeled that are compact fluorescents labeled as energy efficient or Energy Star certified, but that labeling is outdated and should be removed from any catalogs. Linear fluorescents, similarly, linear fluorescent retrofit lamps are significantly about twice as energy efficient as a fluorescent lamp. So LEDs, more efficient, twice as efficient as linear fluorescent lamps. So you can often take a linear fluorescent lamp out and then replace it directly and improve your energy efficiency with just by popping a new lamp in. Next slide. Similarly, LEDs last about 2 to 3 times longer. So a self-ballasted CFL that looks like the ice cream cone typically is 8 to 12,000 hours in rated life, whereas LEDs, especially those on the Energy Star program, they start at 15,000 hours and their rated life goes up to 25,000. There's even more, but this is the typical rated life. So you get about twice as much life, and so they don't have to be manufactured, replaced, or disposed of as often, reducing both environmental impacts and cost. Next slide. Consequently, as I mentioned earlier, LEDs often end up paying for themselves. This is a little bit complicated of a slide, but what you can see is how all of these different attributes play in together. They're more efficient. They have LEDs are more efficient. They have a longer lifespan. And so very quickly, you can end up having an LED replacement, both in terms of like a compact fluorescent replacement or a replacement for a linear fluorescent. If you replace either of those, you'll quickly get a payback. Next slide. In terms of availability, LEDs are available to replace virtually all types of compact fluorescent lamps. So there are over 10,000 models of Energy Star replacements for CFLs available, and most have a screw-based and they can replace a standard lamp. They can replace flood lamps and directional lamps, and they also can replace pin-based CFLs. So there are models of LEDs that can replace 4-pin models. Most of those can be found on the Design Lights Consortium qualified product list, and they also can replace pin-based, 2-pin-based models. So in every case, there are plenty of LEDs that can be replaced. And most of them, again, can just, you take the old lamp out, you put the new lamp in. Next slide. There's still some opportunity for replacements out there. We know that there's still plenty of CFLs in the market and in people's homes. And so we hope that those will get replaced relatively quickly with relatively available, cost competitive LED lamps. Some of them cost about $2. So you quickly can get a payback, and they're widely available as well. Next slide. I think where there's a lot of more work that really needs to be done is around linear fluorescent lamps. These are often in institutional buildings, but LEDs can replace virtually all linear fluorescent lamps as well. Most of the high-performing products are already listed on the Design Lights Consortium list. So Design Lights Consortium is a coalition of utilities and manufacturers that have gotten together to identify products, and they have a list of products that meet high performance criteria. That means that they're not going to fade quickly, they have good color quality and other technical attributes. And so, for example, there are about 29,000 linear LED lamps that are on the Design Lights Consortium, and they typically will replace linear and U-bent T8s as well as linear T5 lamps. Those are the most common types of fluorescent linear lamps, and there are replacements for all of them. The LED linear lamps are available in all kinds of shapes and lengths and color temperatures. The color temperature is like, what is it, kind of more bluish, which is more for institutional, or is it more for your home, of a warm white? So they're available in all different types of color temperatures and different levels of output, so they can replace various different types of LED or linear fluorescent lamps that might be in place now. Perhaps the most important point here is that many of the LED models are plug and play or hybrid models. And sometimes the industry said, oh, you know, LEDs are not ready and you're going to have to replace the whole fixture and it's going to be really cost effective. That is not true. Most of the LED lamps that are on the Design Lights Consortium list are what are called plug and play, or they're hybrid models. So plug and play means you literally can take the lamp out and put the new one in. You don't have to do any new wiring. You don't have to replace the ballast or the fixture. Some of them will be compatible with the existing ballasts, and many of them are hybrids, which means they also have the option of having an internal, essentially ballasted driver. And so even if it's not compatible with the ballast, it still will run on its own driver. So again, they don't require rewiring and they don't require replacing the ballast. In addition, there also are luminaires and other ones that you could put your own driver in if that's what you prefer. Next slide. Maryland is one of the states that's been documenting their cost savings associated with the purchase of LED lamps, and they've been doing that through their green purchasing program, and they documented about $700,000 in cost savings, plus the greenhouse gas reductions and other emissions just in 1 year of purchasing LED lamps. And that's something that RPN helped them to document. Next slide. So I want to just end by talking about some of the recommendations that can accelerate the transition from fluorescents to LEDs. So at the federal level, they can start purchasing only LED lighting for their facilities and block fluorescents from their contracts. And we saw President Biden say something similar about electric vehicles. The federal government is only going to buy electric vehicles. Well, let's have a similar initiative around LED lighting. And this is consistent with their executive order on climate change. Next slide. The EPA has an environmentally preferable purchasing program, and they can adopt green lighting specifications for federal contracts. They have over $550 billion pocketbook. They buy lots of lighting equipment, and so adopting a green lighting specification at the federal level would help to facilitate that transition for federal facilities. Next slide. State and local governments similarly can adopt contracts. I've helped many states already do this. And so they develop a contract for environmentally preferable lighting equipment, and it increases the number and types of LED lighting products that are available at discounted prices. And they can make those contracts available to school districts, to universities, to local governments as well. And there also are things that can be done to motivate those using agencies, setting goals for those agencies and buyers, working with businesses and helping consumers to do that. There's a model program in California out here called the Million LED Lamp Challenge. So that could be replicated in other states as well. Next slide. For lighting equipment and manufacturers and retailers, in addition to what Peter was mentioning earlier, they could just stop selling fluorescent lighting equipment, and they can offer more LED lighting products that are certified by Energy Star Design Lights Consortium to ensure high performing products, and then team up with utilities to offer rebates. I will say we're still seeing a lot of fluorescents being offered by commercial lighting vendors, and they will still say the fluorescents are energy efficient, label them with a green leaf, say that they're an environmentally preferable product. And we really want that to change so that really the only thing that's labeled as an environmentally preferable product is an LED. Next slide. So that's the end, and we're looking forward to hearing your comments and questions, and you can also email us if you have any questions that don't get answered today. So thank you.
Thanks, Alicia, and thank you, Michael, Peter, and Alicia for that comprehensive overview of the report, for talking to us about the health risk associated to mercury in using lighting, for telling us what to do and not to do when lamps break, and Alicia, your overview of the benefits of LEDs and ways of accelerating that transition is very clear. So thank you for that. I missed to say at the beginning, for participants that want to pose questions, please use the Q&A option. We are already seeing some questions coming in, and I think we're gonna start addressing those before transitioning to the panel. Some participants asked on the chat if the presentations are going to be available. Yes, we will be sharing the presentations in a PDF version. We will be making the recording of this webinar available as well. So if there are people that couldn't join us today, we'll be making sure that they have access to this as well. And someone on the chat also posed a question about where they can obtain the 3-page recommendation for taking care of a small spill. That's included in the report as well, in one of the annexes as well. So we'll make sure that you get a copy of the report as well. I invite Michael, Peter, and Alicia to turn their cameras on. Questions are coming in, and I think we want to address some of these questions first before we move into the panel session. So let me maybe pose the question so that everyone can see which one we are addressing, and then I invited you to respond after that. Jillian is asking, I remember in secondary school, CFLs being an image of sustainability. Did they replace incandescents because their energy efficiency outweighed their mercury environmental hazard?
Yeah, that was the claim, that there was less coming out of the power plants because the power plants are burning coal. But we've always questioned that. We've questioned how much weight they were given to the coal. I thought some of the calculations early on were overestimating the benefits associated with, using compact fluorescent lamps, but that was the argument, that there was a trade-off because the CFLs are more energy efficient.
And if I could just add to that, the other idea at that point was that there was going to be a robust recycling system established in the U.S. And although we tried for a number of years with our NGO partners and getting take-back legislation, only Maine and Vermont were able to successfully do that. And as I mentioned in my presentation, consequently, the recycling rates in the US are pretty low, higher with the business community of around 30%. The few states that do have these take-back requirements have more robust recycling, but overall, as I outlined in my presentation, almost more than 2/3 of the lamps are improperly disposed of. And whenever a fluorescent lamp breaks, the mercury gets emitted, and some initially and the rest over time. And so that's just another piece of the puzzle that didn't really work out as hoped.
Thanks, Michael. And maybe that takes us to the next question, which is related to disposing of lamps. Team Goncharov had a question about these. The problems with fluorescents are clear. Disposing of legacy lamps is a huge problem, which will go on for years. In Santa Cruz County, California, old hardware and lighting stores accept fluorescents for free recycling and disposal. And other California counties have similar programs. And his question is, shouldn't we have similar programs everywhere, funded by the lighting producers?
If I could again, I mean, I just mentioned that earlier. We had a multi-state mercury products campaign. We worked in many instances in collaboration with the members of the Interstate Mercury Reduction Clearinghouse. That's the consortium that NUMOA created to assist states in implementing their legislation. And because of the cost of the collection and recycling, there wasn't a lot of support from the manufacturers to add those costs in to the purchase price of the products. And so there were a number of states where the industry really fought to have those kind of programs. And as a result, a number of the more conscientious states ended up, developing their own programs. But again, that goes away from the idea of the polluter pays, and it places the responsibility and the costs on the municipal governments who really, they don't have all that much funding to be able to clean up for, if you will, an industry mess. So we ended up with a disbalance between the promotion of energy efficient lighting and unfortunately the disposal got left by the wayside.
Thanks, Michael. I think this is also in response to a question from Jay Horo. In most municipalities, how do residents dispose of unbroken fluorescent lamps? And specifically, if they are doing it in the usual trash stream. So the answer is most likely.
Well, right. I mean, there are many communities. When I say many, not all communities, but communities in some of the more progressive states that have household hazardous waste collection programs, small business collection programs. They call the conditionally exempt small quantity generator collection programs. Again, these programs cost, when you're dealing with hazardous waste, especially mercury, the costs for disposal are pretty high. And so there really hasn't been the commitment there for that kind of program. And again, it goes back to who should be paying for an industry product that industry makes, industry profits from. And then, for those municipalities that do step up, they have to add that to their budgets.
Thanks, Michael. There is a question for someone that works in a group who collects fluorescents to be recycled. Norma Chanis, she is saying, we often get boxes which include broken bulbs. Am I correct in assuming we should bag them for disposal ASAP, or has whatever mercury was in there has been dispersed?
Right, if I understand the question correctly, I mean, the first thing is obviously to not expose people in the general vicinity when a lamp breaks. As we know from the main study and others, the initial breakage period is when we need to remember to ventilate. That's the most important thing, to ventilate the area if you can, and to remove yourself and young children, pregnant women, pets, everyone from that area. And then, to the extent possible, to isolate those materials, at the very least, get them outside of the building. And then the next step would be just to determine how, what the best way is to handle those broken materials. And the EPA guidance, there's US EPA guidance in the back of our report, as Anna mentioned, there's ATSDR guidance. And in addition, there are a number of state departments of environmental protection that also have recommendations online as well.
I think an important part of this is just to say that recycling is not the solution to this problem. We just can't prevent this type of breakage, and it's happening in people's homes. It's happening in the garbage trucks, as Michael mentioned. It's happening at various different places. Somebody is trying to do the right thing. They take it to the store, but then they throw in something, or somebody else throws in something. I mean, I've been in the store and seen literally a big T12 just drop on the floor. It's just, they're so fragile, and the mercury is then just volatile. So we just need to try to move away as quickly as possible, because recycling, there's just no way you're going to be able to prevent those types of problems.
If I could add just a brief comment. If there are broken lamps in a box, then the box is contaminated probably, and there are probably glass shards at the bottom of the box. with some residual mercury. So like Michael was saying, the most important thing you can do in the near term is to make sure the box stays outside or in a well-ventilated area, and then just to bag everything up as quickly as you can.
Thank you, Peter, for those recommendations. There were some questions related now to the LED transition, and I think maybe Alicia, this is a question for you. CPUC has stopped funding LED transitions, so those that at least can afford the transition may be saddled by legislation requiring LEDs. The question is, could the proposed legislation to ban mercury also include a requirement that CPUC restart funding the LED transitions for small businesses and disadvantaged communities?
Yeah, I think that they could. I mean, CPUC, they're like a utility, and if there are people who cannot, even though it's cost competitive and you save money and pays for itself, still in many cases the incandescent light bulb still could be the cheapest upfront cost. And so there still may be people who just either don't understand why it's important to make that transition, from either a compact, an incandescent or a compact fluorescent to the LEDs, or they might see, a cheaper product in the market. So yes, I think anytime if there is legislation that would say ban the other products from the market, it should include some program to also help those who may not be able to afford the upfront cost, which is not significant at this point. I mean, the cost is pretty reasonable and competitive at this price, but still somebody might not want to take a light bulb out of the socket and pay to update it to an LED. So that can help with that.
Thank you, Alicia. I want to make sure we have time to move on to our panel. We have some guests from organizations working on protecting children's health, preventing pollution, reducing toxics, and mercury pollution as well. So I want to make sure that we transition to that. But participants, please continue putting questions on the Q&A. We'll make sure that we take notes of those to answer independently, or we may have time at the end of the conversation as well to continue answering those questions. So I want to invite the panelists to turn on their videos, and I'm going to be welcoming you to this discussion, and thank you for joining us today. Let me start by giving you a big background on who we have. We have Andrea Ventura, who is the Legislative and Policy Director at Clean Water Action. Andrea left a corporate career in publishing in 1995 to join Clean Water Action's New Jersey chapter, working on drinking water, pollution prevention, and source water protection. She then joined the California Clean Water staff in May 2003 and represented them on the Environment Justice Coalition for Water's Program Advisory Committee, the Change Coalition, the Peace NGO Policy Work Group, and the Safer States Coalition working on toxics. Key areas of Andrea's work include addressing mercury and PFAS in water, developing beneficial uses of water to protect tribes and subsistence fishers, surface water cleanup and protection, drinking water contaminants, chemical policy programs, and promoting green chemistry. Thank you, Andrea, for joining us today. Thank you. We also have Hester Paul. Hester has worked as the National Director of Children's Environmental Health Networks, an eco-healthy childcare program since 2010. She is responsible for leading the further expansion of the EHCC program so that children throughout the nation benefit from the reduction of harmful environmental toxics within and around childcare facilities. Hester and her colleagues offer comprehensive training, technical assistance, and resources to childcare professionals. And additionally, the team incorporates environmental health best practices into national health and safety standards, national accreditation standards, as well as state quality rating improvement standards, with the goal of uplifting policies to prevent children's unnecessary exposures to toxic chemicals within early care and learning settings. Thank you so much for joining us today, Hester. We also have Paul Burns. Paul is Vermont Public Interest Research Group's Executive Director. He's been in that position since 2001. Payback is Vermont's largest nonprofit consumer and environmental advocacy organization. In these past few years, Payback has played a major role in several landmark achievements, including the nation's first ban on fracking, tough new regulations on toxics, and the precedent-setting requirement that GMO foods be labeled. Paul's leadership has been integral to the success of those campaigns. Previously, he worked for 15 years as an attorney, advocate, and organizer for PERCs in New York and Massachusetts. Thank you for joining us today, Paul. Finally, we have Andy Bray. Andrew is a project manager at Northeast Waste Management Officials Association, NUMOA, and he currently manages the Interstate Mercury Education and Reduction Clearinghouse, the IMERC, helping its 14 member states implement mercury education and reduction legislation and initiatives. He also manages NUMOA's pollution prevention and sustainability program and the information technology infrastructure of the association, overseeing all assets and various online resources, including the high priority chemicals data system. And he holds a master's degree in civil engineering with an environmental concentration from the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Thank you so much for our panelists to joining us today. We wanted to have an opportunity to discuss and get your reactions on the report today. And let me maybe start with you, Hester. Michael and Peter explained some of the health risks to children and other vulnerable populations following mercury exposure when the lamps break. I wanted to learn about your organization's efforts in raising awareness to educate stakeholders, especially in childcare facilities and other facilities, on these risks and maybe on how to mitigate those risks.
Great, thank you. So the Eco Healthy Childcare Program, if you're not yet familiar, is based within Children's Environmental Health Network. And we work to distill all environmental health best practices and provide affordable and realistic solutions for how childcare professionals can make changes right away in their childcare environments to reduce exposures. So with regard to mercury, for years, first we put together a Train the Trainer course that not just covers mercury, but also covers lead exposures, plastics, et cetera. It's a 5-hour course that has been offered in 33 states. We would travel to those states and usually convene about 40 to 100 higher level childcare professionals. So that might be licensing staff, nurse and health consultants, or trainers who would take the information and then perpetuate it to their constituents. For mercury, for many years, we were putting together all of the supplies that folks would need to put together a cleanup kit for compact fluorescent light bulbs. And there were many challenges with this. So first of all, you are usually educating childcare professionals for sometimes the very first time about what mercury even is, why it's problematic in general for children and also providers who might be childbearing, that might still be breastfeeding. So first of all, you have the tackle of educating them about mercury. And then you have the tackle of saying, we want you to make sure that you always have a cleanup kit on hand. And as discussed in the presentation, the information from EPA or ATSDR is good, but it's very comprehensive. It's very confusing to providers. And even if you support them in providing the materials and giving them the materials so that they can have a cleanup kit on hand, you have a very high rotation of staff in childcare facilities. So if not everybody understands how to properly clean up mercury and not sweep and not get out the vacuum, make sure the kids are getting out with the staff, you have this reoccurring problem of making sure that somebody is adequately educated, making sure that they have the materials on site, you know, like the little doppers to pick it up, the flashlights, and then making sure if there's staff rotation that all staff are understanding what they can do. So that's historically how we have been educating childcare professionals. And certainly now the best practice is just to point to LEDs. So I'll stop there.
And I wanted to follow up on that. So thank you for explaining the guidelines that you have provided. And definitely it sounds like it's a challenging effort, especially because of the detailed guidance of the training and of the turnover as well. Are you already providing specific recommendations to these groups on the transition, or maybe following the presentation today? Is there anything else that you would recommend these groups in terms of taking action?
Yeah, so everything that was said today is certainly something that we will perpetuate, and we have been already talking about just purchasing LEDs. The challenges, as discussed already, is that first of all, it just requires education. So we can be one convener of trying to educate childcare professionals, but certainly we need more people to be educating. And part of that is our responsibility to be reaching out and engaging with those thought leaders in early care and education. And so often we are at this nexus point of bringing environmental health considerations to childcare leaders. There isn't many groups focusing exclusively on childcare for environmental health. So one of our responsibilities can be bringing it to the national accreditation groups, the national health and safety groups, licensing, and making sure that those higher level staffers are aware of these opportunities and aware of the fact that they can be shifting to purchasing LEDs. So I'd say the first thing is tackling the education with the right groups. And then the second thing is the finances. So although they are very comparable in cost, like Alicia was saying, it's still getting people to believe it's a better solution to pull those light bulbs all out and replace them. So there could be work that maybe Claire Barnett can do and that we can do to see when the funding rolls out, how could some of the funds that are distributed to states be used to support childcare professionals in replacing the LEDs, replacing the compact fluorescent light bulbs right away so that we can circumvent any potential issues that, you know, inevitably will occur at some points.
Thank you, Hester. And I invite if other, I wish we can have a conversation. So if others had something to comment on these responses, please jump in. Otherwise, I'll follow with the next questions. But I want to make sure that we have a very nice conversation on this as well. Maybe, Andrea, if I can turn over to you. You represent the Clean Water Action in California, which of course focuses on protecting water quality. Why is your organization concerned about mercury pollution from fluorescent lamps? And why do you think it's important to address specifically the source of mercury pollution?
Oh, absolutely. So thank you for that question. First of all, we as an organization do care about the environment in general, and your home, your classroom, your workplace, that is an environment. So we do want to protect people from the problems associated with these lighting, with these fluorescent lamps in those environments as well. But for many, many years, I have worked on mercury pollution in water. So a couple of things to note about that is that it takes very little mercury to contaminate an average size lake. I mean, we're talking about the size of a coin. And when we say it's contaminated, it means that it becomes unsafe, not only for wildlife purposes, but our focus, which is more human, for fishing. Now, I am not here to say that people shouldn't eat, fish. Fish has many dietary benefits. But we have waterways in this state that are so contaminated by mercury that we do not have any what we call assimilative capacity. In other words, we cannot add, no matter what the source is, any more mercury into our waters. And that is a particular threat because when we work on cleanup plans for mercury, there are no real clear answers. It's not like you can go into a waterway and just clean it up. Okay, it's a complicated issue, the way mercury acts in the environment. Yet when we do cleanup plans, we are looking at somebody who may throw a line into a water body once in a while. And the truth of the matter is that if you look at waterways like San Francisco Bay, people fish for basic subsistence. People are eating a lot of fish out of those waterways, and they're feeding that fish to their families. And that is either out of economic need or out of cultural tradition. We have tribal communities that this is a part of their tradition going back millennia. Okay, we have other immigrant groups who this is what they did in their home countries. And so we fought for many years to recognize the needs of subsistence fishing in mercury. Mercury is a heavy metal. If it's coming out of the products that we use every day, we cannot afford to be using those products anymore. What goes up goes down. When that vapor goes up into the air, when these things break, it comes back down into our waterways. And so we have extremely contaminated mercury. It's not all coming from lamps, but we can't afford any more mercury coming into our system. We can't treat our way out of this problem, and we need to stop its use right now. And this is one area where we can do that.
Absolutely. And I think we're talking earlier in the conversation, and we heard from Michael and Peter that recycling was thought to be one of the solutions to make sure that that mercury pollution wouldn't go into the water, wouldn't go into other resources as well. What we know right now is that recycling rates are low in the US. I wanted to ask, what is your perspective on terms of recycling, and has it been successful in California? Has it been effective in preventing mercury pollution?
I think it's please let me be clear. I think that, first of all, I can only tell you anecdotally about recycling rates in California, despite the fact that we have laws that require recycling and special handling of fluorescent lights. I live in an apartment. My own landlord, when he would take them out of our kitchen, would put them in the trash until the environmentalist in me knocked on the door and said, you can't do that, you know. I think that my answer to that and our perspective of clean water is that we need to do everything we can to avoid pollution, whether it's mercury or any other kind of toxic chemical at the source. We cannot recycle or treat our way out of our problems. And so while there is nothing that's perfect, and we heard that from Alicia Culver, you know, frankly, mercury should never have been in the toolkit to save energy. You know, that's just putting one problem in, you know, replacing it with another. So, you know, recycling wasn't the answer. Now, the reality is we have fluorescent lights out there that are being used. We are going to need to make sure that we have programs that can collect those, as you know, and to ratchet down on what's out there being used and in the environment. But ultimately, it's not the solution. Ultimately, we have to stop the use of these right now. And we have developed a technology that is a massive improvement on reducing the toxic implications of saving energy. That's why we have to promote the LEDs more than we have to promote the recycling.
Thank you, Andrea. Let me turn it over to you, Paul, because I think we have a case study on Vermont that already offers to provide a solution. Especially there is a Vermont law that places the burden on lab manufacturers to prove that there are no alternatives or there are no comparable mercury-free lighting if they want to sell these lamps as well. So I think that there seems to be a clear opportunity here, and I wanted to hear from you. How can we encourage state action, especially considering this law, to replace fluorescent lighting with LEDs?
Well, first let me say, Anna, what an honor it is to be here on this panel with the other great folks. And I want to say too, that this report has already had an immediate impact here in Vermont. My organization, working with Michael Bender and Mercury Policy Project, has worked on these issues for many years here in Vermont. And it was about 10 years ago that Vermont policymakers had the foresight to craft a law that says, while we recognize there are certain benefits at that time, they recognized to the fluorescent lamps, they said, we're only going to allow manufacturers to sell them in Vermont as long as they can prove that there are no comparably performing alternatives at a cost that is equal to or better than. And so the burden in Vermont is on manufacturers to prove to the state environmental agency that there are no alternatives to their mercury-containing lamps. That's about as good a setup as we can hope for. And so when the report came out, my organization petitioned the state environmental agency immediately to conduct a review to essentially demand justification from the manufacturers as to why they should continue to be allowed to sell their products in the state. That process has been initiated, and the lamp manufacturers have been given a December 1 deadline to provide evidence that would justify the continued sale of their products in the state. Maybe they'll get an extension, but we're in this process now. And then we will have an opportunity, and I hope to work with many of you who are participating here today on comments and to gather data and present it to our state agency folks, who will then make a decision, hopefully fairly early in the new year. And if all goes well, Vermont will be the first state to prohibit the sale of mercury-containing lamps in the state, at least for as many categories as we possibly can. Failing that, we have legislators who are also interested in this report and interested in moving forward as well. We know there'll be fights over how do you define cost, for instance, and the legislation is silent on that. But maybe we need to come back and clarify that if we don't get the solution that we want out of the administrative process. But we are hopeful right now. I've been having good conversation even this morning with both legislative leaders, the chair of the key environmental committee talking about this, getting the report in her hands. I mean, it's just very, very compelling to any, as far as I'm concerned, any reasonable person who sees this and says, you know, we now have lamps that are better for the environment, better for public health, better for climate, and better for consumers. What the heck, you know, why would you not move forward with those? And the data provided in this report and all the other work that so many of the people and organizations do here is just going to be a great help to us. So I hope that Vermont can be something of a model and prove that it is possible to move forward this way. And then I hope others will do the same. You know, we're not going to solve the problem here, but if we can go first and create a model that is replicable elsewhere, then I hope others will pick up on that.
Thank you for sharing that, Paul. We are very excited to hear the news. We are looking forward to what happens on that December 1st deadline. Of course, we will be happy to work with you and with the rest of these partners to provide any support needed. Thank you for sharing that, because I agree with you. It seems like we got a pathway forward, and Vermont can provide a model and a case study to follow in other states. Do you think there are any other policy changes or market campaigns that we could potentially promote or use to accelerate the transition and to promote the transition from fluorescent lamps to LEDs, besides the state level efforts that you mentioned?
Well, the one other piece that I would mention, it's kind of related to this, and it is that on the collection piece, as Michael Bender mentioned earlier, Vermont is one of just a small number of states who require manufacturers to take responsibility, at least in terms of the cost of collecting the mercury-containing lamps in the state. The law, though, says that if they stop selling the lamps in the state, they no longer have to contribute and play that role of collecting them. So if we win and ban the sale of these things, they may say, well, then we're done collecting them. So we probably need to change that law. That's the other piece that we will actually go back and do, is to try to make sure that they're still on the hook appropriately for all those lamps that are still in use out there until a reasonable time, you know, when we think that the useful life of those lamps has ended. So I think that's the other kind of related piece from our perspective that would be important.
Absolutely, thank you for that. Andy, let me turn it over to you. I think we've heard about some solutions at the state level. I'm interested in hearing, based on your experience and in the work that you're doing with IMERC and NUMOA, if there are any other policy changes or recommendations that we could provide to states that are interested in transitioning to LEDs, in updating their mercury reduction laws, following what we just heard.
Yeah, a few things come to mind, Anna. And let me first just say that my comments are my own. I'm happy to work with the states under IMERC, but my opinions today are just my own, based on my experience in this work. But I will say that, you know, the first thing that comes to mind is, you know, we've had a lot of success with the model legislation that's been in place in the IMERC states for a number of years now. But what would really be helpful is if we had more states adopt that legislation. You know, we're lucky that we had the model to work from, so we don't have much of a patchwork, which you see in a number of other initiatives that come up from the state level. But we still have a map with, you know, we've only got 8 notification states in the nation, so we do run into issues all the time of applicability and, oh, I'm not manufacturing it in an IMERC state, but I am selling it into an IMERC state, so I need to report. So it would be great to have more states adopt that, both the notification, labeling, bans, and phase out provisions of those laws. I think that we've seen an impact from those laws over time, and that would only be amplified the more states that adopt those laws. I think it would be great to have nationwide uniformity on it, really. Another thing that comes to mind is, as someone said earlier, I think it was Alicia, you know, we're not going to recycle our way out of this problem. This is not an area where we should be striving for circularity. We don't want to keep mercury moving through the economy. So what do we do about that? I think we really need to look at how do we go about through policy, through national policy, how do we sunset mercury? How do we get it out of the marketplace? What does that look like? You know, we're making progress with phase downs and phase outs through the states of products that contain mercury. The marketplace is adjusted on its own in some ways, but it's still a problem. You know, the better we are at recycling it, the more of a a stockpile, the more we're driving down the cost of it, really, because there's just more of it available. And then I guess the third piece is, the EPR legislation that was mentioned that's in place in Vermont and Maine. I think it would be really helpful to have similar provisions in place in other states. And maybe as like looking at building those EPR provisions, maybe building in a gradual reduction over time and a transfer over to LEDs and creating some elements within those provisions to help accelerate that. Yeah, I think those are the three big things that come to mind.
Thank you, Andy. And I think the last one is a very important point because we still have a large stock of CFLs and LFLs that will need to be disposed properly. So definitely EPR mechanisms are still relevant and something that should be into consideration. I'd like to invite participants to pose questions to this wonderful panel here, also to the authors of the report. We have everyone available here to answer any additional questions. So please feel free to type in your questions on the Q&A. I think we've already answered most of those that were already posed here. I see one question on EPR schemes, which I think we already answered. So I will invite everyone to provide additional questions for this wonderful group of panelists. And if not, if anyone has any other remarks or reactions to the discussion here, please jump in.
So one of the questions that came out was, are there any other policies? And even though we definitely want to get fluorescent lamps banned, we want to say farewell to fluorescents, throughout the market. But one of the good places to start is in procurement. It's a way to really get things going. And there is a model in Washington state where it's similar language to what's in Vermont, where it says the state may not buy a mercury containing product unless there's no alternative. And then they had a carve out for fluorescent lamps. Well, if it's more energy efficient, you don't have to follow that. Well, now that things have flipped, we're going in with the state of Washington to create a model there on procurement and just trying to get all the fluorescents off and saying, look, this is what your law says. And a lot of times these laws get passed, but people didn't even know that they're there. They've been on the books for many years. And all of a sudden, wow, wait a second, things have changed to the point that we can now enforce the law, like similar to what Paul was saying in Vermont. So we're going to also be pushing a procurement strategy in multiple states. So if anyone's interested in working with us on that, to really just try to get, only LEDs on contracts so we can further drive the price down, because a lot of times the contracts have very few LEDs. They're very highly priced because they've been treated as a niche product for a lot of these contracts. So we really want to drive the price down and increase and use the state's procurement as a lead by example situation.
Andy, please go ahead.
Just about on, this was touched on a little bit about the change out programs and the success of those change out programs at the state level, to really accelerate the transition and help to underwrite it really. And I think there's a great opportunity to grow those programs into other areas, such as what Hester was mentioning about childcare facilities and really, creating the funding mechanisms necessary to make that happen. It's a twofer really, because we're not only, getting the energy and environmental benefit of getting those mercury containing lamps out of places, but we're also, they're going straight in some cases, they're going straight into the state's recycling program. That's the case in Massachusetts, where they're going directly to a state approved vendor, which means that they're being handled properly.
Esther, please go ahead.
I was just going to comment more about, there seems to be a lot about policy questions. And obviously the goal is eventually, right, to just remove mercury entirely. For childcare, because childcare licensing regulations they are created on a state-by-state basis. So sometimes it's very nebulous to try to work through. The one caveat is that Head Start and early Head Start facilities are run by the federal government. And so there are Head Start facilities in all 50 states, and these are the children that are most vulnerable, right? So one thing that we'll try to do right away is just reach out to some federal partners at the Office of Child Care and Head Start and make sure they've seen the report and see if, even if we can get the wheels turning now, and even if it takes a while for them to consider creating a policy that only LED lighting is allowable. And then once you would have that federal mandate for those that are most vulnerable in Head Starts, then at least you could hopefully see this trickling effect of individual states either choosing to follow suit with childcare licensing, or another option that we often work within is non-mandated standards that improve the quality of childcare. So they're not mandated, but they certainly help childcare facilities in earning more business and being more attractive to parents because they're going above and beyond what's required by childcare licensing regulations.
Thank you. And it sounds to me like the mandate will also support solving some of the challenges that you mentioned about financing mechanisms, because possibly there will be attached already some funding in order to comply and with the requirement. Do you see it that way?
Well, so one thing that we have seen in light of the COVID pandemic is that there's been more attention, generally speaking, to environmental health considerations in childcare. Now, most of that truly has been sanitizing, cleaning, disinfecting, and then as the research came out, it shifted to ventilation. But it is definitely a foot in the door for childcare professionals caring more than they ever had before about chemical exposures, and this is another avenue for bringing information to them. So although, their initial entrants are going to be to try to remain open and combat COVID, we've seen that it's an entry point to talk about lead, right? More lead testing for water. And this certainly could be just another way that we can bring to light. This is another facet of environmental health that's very important. There's something you can do about it. And we already have the cost effectiveness analyzed, where we really don't want to be putting forth things that are not cost effective because there isn't extra money in childcare. And this is something that, right, everyone's hearing more about now than you ever have before. But given that there is a solution, as I stated before, I think it's mostly about education initially, and then making sure that all of the different players are on board. And part of that would be starting also with state health departments, because they're seen as credible, right? Like we can do all that we can from our perspective as an NGO, but you need people who are credible at the state health department to be really voicing this. And now we have the resources we can be pointing to.
Absolutely. Thank you. Andrea, please go ahead.
So I just wanted to add kind of the consumer aspect of this too, because we're talking here about the institutional use of lights, which is huge and is also something we can drive and very, very important. But it's the average consumer who's not going to know what to do when that light bulb breaks. Okay, there's not going to be some sort of program that is meant to teach them how to do that. As somebody who never bought fluorescent, I've never bought a fluorescent light bulb myself, because if I work on Mercury, I was not going to go in that direction. I just tried to turn my lights off more often. I was gratified when I went into both Walgreens recently and the dollar store, because Alicia and I were talking about this, and found that they were not selling fluorescent lights anymore. They were selling only LEDs. I still have some incandescents under a shelf, that, but I would, I am buying LEDs now for my lighting purposes. I think that the pressure on, one of the strategies in the report that's really important is pressure on retailers, because that's what drives both. It gives NGOs like us, if there are campaigns around that, the ability to educate our members and members of the public on why we are asking Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever company not to sell these anymore, because we don't want our members exposed to these chemicals. It also, drives the marketplace. And I know that Clean Water Action is part of the Mind the Store campaign. And I think Vermont PIRG is as well. We have found that a very useful campaign in things around PFAS and methylene chloride in paint strippers, to get stores to just stop selling it. So it's great that Walgreens is doing it. It's great that, my dollar store only had LEDs for $1, but I think we're going to need a lot more from the big hardware chains that people go to for lighting, particularly the ones in apartment kitchens, you know, like mine, that are the long, lengthy ones. We need to start switching those out. And my landlord shouldn't be able to go and buy a Mercury lamp anymore. So.
Yeah, I agree with you, and thank you for the suggestion. And definitely we see larger retailers. I want to point to IKEA, I want to point to Costco as well, that are not selling fluorescents anymore, but a lot of them continue to do so. And I agree that approaching and raising awareness on this opportunity is going to be a key way of reducing the amount of fluorescents in the market, and of course, increasing the availability of LEDs for consumers across the board. Michael, please go ahead.
Thanks, Anna, and I wanted to take the opportunity again to thank Andy and maybe put him on the spot. Andy, I'm just wondering, you know, Alicia talked a bit about procurement policies at the state level, and whether that's an area, you know, given that, you know, we have all these products that are banned in the IMERC states, but the one that isn't is fluorescent lighting. And it seems to me sort of a softer approach than what's being sort of explored in Vermont right now to ban outright sale. Is that within the realm of the IMERC sort of mission statement to promote source reduction of mercury added products? And if so, as an associate member of IMERC, is there an opportunity for me to raise that with the IMERC states to see whether or not there might be some consideration? Because again, you know, we're not mandating that everyone has to do something, but we're encouraging state purchasing groups to really look in this direction. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. Well, as an associate member, it's duly noted. Writing it down right now. And yes, we have, you know, we've had procurement groups around different issues in the past. So we have a network established, you know, within our states to explore that question. You know, just want to back up for a sec. We do have 4 states that do have sales ban provisions. They're largely all tied to their mercury content restrictions. So bulbs over a certain amount of mercury are not allowed for sale in those states, and that's Connecticut, Louisiana, in Rhode Island. Vermont has restrictions on neon lamps, but that's just an aside. So they have addressed it that way, not directly as a product category, but as mercury content. And then, yeah, I think it's kind of a no-brainer. You know, we have a number of states that are very active in the green procurement EPP space. New York has issued a number of executive orders that are really helping drive the marketplace in terms of how the state's using its spending dollars. And there's other examples I could call out, but I think it's a really reasonable question to explore, Michael.
Thank you, Andy. Well, we've heard today some excellent suggestions on how to accelerate the transition to LEDs, from executive orders to state level action to recommendations to different stakeholders. I invite everyone who wants to continue this conversation to reach out to us. We'll be definitely sharing information of the webinar, the PDF, and the outcomes of these conversations with all the participants. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, especially Michael, Peter, and Alicia, the authors of the report, and the wonderful group of panelists that we had today, Hester, Paul, Andy, and Andrea. Thank you so much for your suggestions, for your excellent ideas, and for the great news as well of what's happening in Vermont. And I think with that, we can conclude the webinar today. I don't know if anyone has any last comments or remarks, but I think we've enjoyed very much the conversation, and especially the opportunity to discuss how to accelerate and continue this transition to a clean and efficient lighting market.
And I did have one last thought, and
yes.
You know, it's really in a global context. Is that you know, we have this history of moving away from problematic products and chemistries in the U.S. and in other developed nations, and there's you know, oftentimes there's a migration of those technologies and problems to underdeveloped nations. So I'm you know, in as much as this is being pursued, I'm glad it's being pursued at a global level to avoid that.
Absolutely, and I'm happy to respond to that as well. And that's the intention of the global campaign. We know that many markets like the European Union and other developing economies are already transitioning to LEDs only and phasing out fluorescents on the basis of mercury and on the basis of energy efficiency as well. So more and more we see developing economies as becoming dumping grounds, and of course, there needs a mechanism or a global framework to make sure that we accelerate this transition to LEDs, not only in the US, but across the globe as well. So thank you for pointing that out. Well, I think with that, we'll conclude the webinar. And again, I want to show my appreciation to all the panelists and to the team at CLASP as well that facilitated having this webinar. And I wish everyone a happy and productive day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.